The heavy, suffocating scent of thousands of imported white orchids filled the grand ballroom of the Beaumont estate, but to Julian Vance, it smelled exactly like a crime scene. Outside, the rain lashed viciously against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a brutal contrast to the flawless, blinding opulence within. Flashbulb lightning from the paparazzi line outside illuminated the faces of hundreds of elite guests, all dressed in silks and diamonds, completely oblivious to the countdown clock ticking down to the destruction of the Vance empire. The air was thick with the low, rhythmic hum of wealthy chatter, the clinking of crystal flutes, and the sweet, agonizing strain of a live string quartet. But beneath the surface of this perfect high-society fairy tale, a fuse was already burning. Welcome back to the channel, my beautiful family. I am so incredibly grateful to have you here with us today for what is bound to be the most intense, emotionally gripping journey we have ever taken together. Before we dive into the heart of this storm, I want to take a moment to say hello to all of you watching from every corner of the world. Whether you are tuning in from the bustling streets of New York, the quiet towns of the UK, the beautiful landscapes of Australia, or anywhere in between, please drop a comment down below and let me know where you are watching from today. How are you doing? I truly hope you are safe, healthy, and ready for a story that will challenge everything you think you know about family, betrayal, and love. If you haven't already joined our incredible community, please take a single second right now to hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and leave a thumbs up. Your incredible support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, you are not going to want to miss a single second of what happens next. Julian Vance stood in the shadow of the velvet curtains, his hands clenched into tight fists inside the pockets of his tailored coat. His throat burned with an ancient, unresolved grief. For 5 agonizing years the world had believed he was dead, or worse, erased. He had been cast out into the freezing darkness of anonymity, stripped of his name, his heritage, and the father he had once idolized. He had survived the freezing nights of exile, the whispered slanders that ruined his reputation, and the crushing weight of a loneliness so profound it nearly broke his mind. He had changed his face, his posture, his very breath, all to survive. But he hadn't returned to this glittering hellhole to claim a fortune. He had returned to stop a slaughter. His eyes locked onto the stage at the front of the ballroom. There stood Arthur Vance, the billionaire patriarch of Vance Global, a man whose word could move stock markets and alter the destinies of thousands. But today, Arthur looked fragile, his broad shoulders slightly hunched beneath his bespoke tuxedo, his silver hair catching the sharp light of the chandeliers. Beside him stood Victoria Sterling, the socialite, the predator, the woman currently wearing a $2 million diamond necklace that belonged to Julian's late mother. Victoria was a vision of terrifying perfection, her silk gown flowing around her like liquid ivory, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. To the media, she was the philanthropic angel who had healed the broken heart of a grieving billionaire widower. But Julian knew the monstrous truth hidden behind those flawless porcelain features. He had the bank registries. He had the encrypted shell company files. Victoria hadn't just seduced her way into his father's life. She was actively bleeding Vance Global dry from the inside out, funneling millions into the hands of a rival syndicate that wanted to see the Vance legacy burned to ash. And the moment she signed that marriage certificate, she would possess the legal authority to liquidate the entire empire, leaving Arthur with nothing but a broken heart and a ruinous scandal. The ceremony will commence in 3 minutes. The coordinator's voice crackled through a hidden earpiece nearby. Julian felt a cold sweat break out across his collarbone. His chest heaved as a wave of sheer vulnerability washed over him. He was one man against an army of security guards, public relations teams, and a crowd of elites who would view him as nothing more than a ghost or an unhinged imposter. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. What if his father hated him? What if Arthur truly was the monster who had ordered his exile all those years ago? The doubt was a sickening black poison in his stomach. If he stepped across that threshold, there was no going back. His anonymity would be shattered forever. He would either save his family or he would be destroyed publicly, crushed under the weight of the Vance machine. He closed his eyes, remembering the smell of the damp, dark room he had been forced to hide in for the first year of his exile, remembering the agonizing tears he had cried when his own father's signature appeared on the banishment papers. But then he remembered the promise he made to himself. The truth will not remain buried. The music shifted. The grand doors at the back of the chapel opened, and Victoria began her slow triumphant march down the aisle toward Arthur. The crowd rose to their feet, gasping at her beauty. Arthur reached out a trembling hand to receive his bride-to-be. Julian gripped the silver flash drive hidden in his palm, the metal biting deep into his flesh until it nearly drew blood. The suspense inside him reached a screaming crescendo. It was time to pull the pin on the grenade. He took a deep breath, stepped out from behind the velvet curtains and strode directly into the center aisle, his voice ringing out like a thunderclap through the sacred silence of the ballroom. "Stop this wedding." The entire room froze. Hundreds of heads snapped around. Victoria's smile instantly withered into a mask of pure shock, and Arthur's eyes widened as if he were looking at a ghost. Julian walked forward, his eyes burning with an unyielding fire, knowing that the secrets he was about to unleash would tear this empire completely apart. But as his eyes locked onto his father's, he saw something else. A dark, terrifying flash of recognition that made Julian's blood run completely cold. Why did his father look more terrified of him being alive than of the wedding being stopped? What dark secret had the billionaire CEO been protecting by erasing his own son? The silence that followed Julian's proclamation was heavy and absolute, broken only by the frantic, desperate tapping of the rain against the glass. The air in the ballroom grew thin, suffocatingly cold, as hundreds of wealthy onlookers turned to stare at the intruder. They did not see the ghost of the empire's lost prince. They saw a stranger clad in a dark, worn coat that contrasted sharply with their pristine silks and tailored wools. But Julian didn't care about their judgment. His entire world had shrunk down to the two people standing on the altar. Julian's deepest desire had never been the money, the skyscraper offices, or the vast shipping fleets that bore his family name. It was simply validation. For the first 18 years of his life, he had lived as a shadow, a secret kept hidden in the sprawling, isolated estate in upstate New York. He was the son of Clara Vance, a brilliant woman from a modest background whom Arthur had loved passionately but secretly. When Clara died in a tragic, unexplained fire when Julian was just 12, Arthur's grief mutated into an icy obsession with security and control. He locked Julian away from the public eye, claiming it was for his protection, while building a public-facing narrative of a lonely, childless billionaire. Julian's greatest fear was that he had never actually mattered to his father, that he was merely a liability, a piece of living evidence of a past Arthur wanted to forget. Beside the altar, Victoria's knuckles turned white as she clutched her bouquet of white orchids. Her sharp, flawless features twitched, a momentary crack in her carefully constructed porcelain mask. To the world, Victoria was the daughter of a ruined European aristocratic family, a tragic, elegant woman who had found solace in Arthur's mature, commanding presence. In reality, she was a financial mercenary. Julian had spent 2 years tracking her trail of ruined men through Zurich, Monaco, and London. She was a master of emotional manipulation, finding powerful men at their lowest, most vulnerable moments, and binding them to her with a web of affection and dependency before draining their corporations through complex networks of offshore shell companies. Standing right behind Victoria was her personal attorney and closest confidant, Lawrence Miller. Lawrence was a man with a wolfish smile and eyes that never settled. He was the architect of Victoria's financial traps, a ruthless strategist who manipulated the legal system with terrifying precision. As Julian walked down the center aisle, Lawrence's hand drifted subtly toward the inside pocket of his jacket, his eyes darting toward the security guards stationed at the perimeter of the ballroom. Julian. The name left Arthur's lips not as a shout, but as a fractured whisper that barely carried past the first row of seats. The billionaire patriarch looked as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly liquefied. His legendary composure, the iron facade that had stared down hostile takeovers and congressional hearings, crumbled in an instant. His chest heaved beneath his bespoke tuxedo, and for a terrifying second, Julian thought his father might suffer a stroke right there on the altar. But it was the nature of that reaction that sent a chill running straight to Julian's marrow. There was no joy in Arthur's eyes. There was no relief of a father seeing a son who had survived a 5-year exile in the dark. There was only a profound, paralyzing terror. It was the look of a man who had built a magnificent fortress on a foundation of corpses, only to see the ground split open. "Security," Victoria hissed, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor blade, though she forced a trembling, victimized tear to roll down her cheek for the benefit of the cameras. Please, someone remove this man. He's disrupted our sacred day. Arthur, darling, who is this unstable person? Don't play the saint with me, Victoria, Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant register that echoed off the high ceilings. He stopped 10 feet from the altar, his boots resting on the pristine white carpet. You know exactly who I am. And you know exactly what I have in my hand. He held up the silver flash drive, the metal catching the sharp glare of the chandelier. Inside that small piece of hardware lay the complete digital footprint of Victoria's betrayal, the falsified transfer orders, the dummy corporations registered in the Cayman Islands under her mother's maiden name, and the encrypted messages planning the systematic dismantling of Vance Global within 48 hours of the marriage license being filed. Julian looked back at his father, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second with a raw, agonizing vulnerability. Father, I didn't come here to ruin you. I came to save you from her. She is bleeding the company dry. She's allied with the Sterling Group's oldest rivals. If you sign that paper, you sign the death warrant of everything Mother helped you build. Arthur stared at his son, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the rain drumming against the roof like a distant war drum. The guests were leaning forward, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of smartphones as a few brave souls began to secretly record the unfolding disaster. Julian, Arthur finally spoke, his voice trembling but laced with an ancient, heavy authority. You shouldn't have come back here. You don't know what you're doing. The words hit Julian like a physical blow to the chest. He had expected anger, he had expected confusion, but he had not expected this profound defensive resistance. His father wasn't defending Victoria. He was defending the wall of secrets he had built around their lives. What did you think of Julian's confrontation? Do you think Arthur is hiding something even worse than Victoria's schemes? Let me know your theories in the comments below, and if you are completely hooked on this family mystery, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the next chapter. Before Julian could answer his father, Lawrence Miller made a sharp sign with his hand. Four massive security guards closed in from the sides, their expressions grim, their hands moving toward their waistbands. The trap was closing, and Julian knew that if he let them drag him out of this room now, he would disappear forever. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the security guards' boots on the marble floor sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Julian's veins. They were closing in, a wall of dark suits and expressionless faces meant to erase him for a second time. The guests held their breath, their eyes darting between the lone man in the aisle and the approaching security team. The tension in the ballroom was a physical weight, pressing down until it felt as though the grand crystal chandeliers above might shatter from the strain. Don't touch him. The command didn't come from Arthur, nor did it come from Victoria. It came from a voice near the front row, clear, sharp, and laced with an undeniable authority that made the guards instantly hesitate. A woman stepped out into the center aisle, positioning herself directly between Julian and the oncoming security team. She wore an elegant deep emerald gown, her dark hair pinned back with a simple pearl clasp, but it was the fierce, unwavering intelligence in her eyes that commanded the room. It was Clara Henderson. Clara was the chief legal counsel for Vance Global's charitable foundation, but more importantly, she was the daughter of Arthur's late co-founder. She had known Julian when they were children, back before the tragedy, back when Julian was allowed to laugh and exist in the sunlight. While Julian had been living in the shadows of exile, Clara had been working within the belly of the beast, quietly noticing the strange financial discrepancies, the sudden shifts in corporate policy, and the terrifying speed with which Victoria Sterling had isolated Arthur from his oldest advisors. Julian's heart skipped a beat as his eyes met hers. For 5 years he had believed he was entirely alone. But looking at Clara now, seeing the recognition and the fierce protectiveness in her gaze, a profound wave of warmth broke through the ice in his chest. It was an unexpected, powerful spark of attraction and hope amidst the chaos. She didn't look at him like he was a ghost or a madman. She looked at him like he was a man worth saving. "Mr. Vance," Clara said, turning her head slightly toward Arthur while keeping her body anchored as a shield for Julian. "As the legal representative of the Foundation, I must advise you that under Section 4 of the corporate bylaws, any direct challenge to the integrity of the family lineage or corporate governance made publicly must be documented and reviewed before a marriage contract involving corporate assets can be finalized. If your guards touch him, They are violating protocol in front of 200 press representatives. Victoria's face twisted into an ugly, venomous sneer, her pristine socialite facade completely dissolving. She's in on it. Arthur, this is a coordinated hit on our family. This man is an imposter, a lunatic hired by our competitors to tank the stock price on our wedding day. Protect me, Arthur. But Julian didn't look at Victoria. He took a decisive step forward, bypassing the frozen guards, his eyes locked entirely on his father. He lifted the silver flash drive and pressed a button on the side. Instantly, the massive digital projection screens flanking the altar, which were supposed to be showing a romantic montage of Arthur and Victoria's vacations, flickered violently. The romantic music stopped entirely, replaced by the harsh, mechanical hum of data transferring. Suddenly, the screens filled with terrifying clarity. It wasn't a photo of the happy couple. It was a scanned ledger of a shell company named Aegis Holdings, registered in Zurich. The documents clearly showed Victoria Sterling's digital signature, authorizing the transfer of $45 million from Vance Global's primary manufacturing division into a private account held by the Gideon Corporation, Arthur's most ruthless and bitter competitor. A collective, deafening gasp rippled through the ballroom. The guests began to murmur frantically, the sound rising like a swarm of hornets. The media cameras at the back of the room flashed like a frenzy of lightning, capturing every single line of the stolen ledger. That's a lie. Those are forged. Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking as she turned to Lawrence Miller, who had gone completely pale. It's not a forgery, Victoria, Julian said, his voice echoing with absolute certainty. Those are the live server logs from 3 nights ago. You didn't just want my father's heart, you wanted his head on a silver platter for the Gideons. You've been draining the company to fund their hostile takeover. Julian turned back to his father, expecting to see the validation he had craved for years. He expected his father to realize the truth, to call off the wedding, to embrace the son who had just saved his life's work. But as Julian looked at Arthur, the world seemed to stop spinning. Arthur wasn't looking at the screens showing Victoria's betrayal. He was staring down at his own hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. A deep, agonizing sorrow washed over the older man's face, followed by a terrifying coldness. Julian, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a register that sounded completely hollow, devoid of any paternal warmth. You think you've uncovered a secret, but you have no idea what you've actually done. Guards, clear the room. All guests, all media leave immediately. But leave my son here. The first major twist had landed, but it wasn't the one Julian expected. His father wasn't surprised by the fraud. He was furious that the spotlight had been turned on. Are you as shocked as Julian by Arthur's cold reaction? What do you think Arthur is trying to hide by clearing the room? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please, if you want to see how this high-stakes family war unfolds, smash that subscribe button and join us for the rest of the journey. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were slammed shut by the security team as the panicked guests were ushered out, leaving Julian, Clara, Arthur, Victoria, and Lawrence entirely alone in the cavernous, orchid-scented silence. The real nightmare was about to begin. The heavy oak doors clicked shut with a sound that echoed like a casket lid sealing them inside the cavernous ballroom. The hundreds of glittering guests and flashing cameras were gone, leaving behind an oppressive, ringing silence. The air felt thick, charged with the lingering electricity of public ruin. The thousands of white orchids, once a symbol of matrimonial perfection, now looked like a shroud over the fractured remnants of the Vance dynasty. Julian stood his ground in the center aisle, his heart hammering against his ribs, though he refused to let his posture waver. Beside him, Clara remained anchored, her presence a steady, calming warmth against the freezing atmosphere of the room. He could feel the slight brush of her emerald silk dress against his coat, a small, physical reminder that for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't fighting in the dark alone. Arthur, you cannot possibly believe this absurd theater, Victoria hissed, her voice dropping its melodic socialite veneer entirely, revealing a sharp, predatory rasp. She paced behind the altar, her diamond heels clicking viciously against the marble. Lawrence, call our legal team. I want this lunatic arrested for defamation, corporate espionage, and harassment before he leaves this property. Lawrence Miller didn't move. His wolfish eyes were locked onto Julian, assessing the threat. The documents he displayed, They contain internal server hashes that only a top-tier systems architect could access. Mr. Vance, if those files leak to the SEC, the trading halt on Vance Global stock will be instantaneous. The files have already been mirrored to a secure external server. Clara stepped forward, her voice cutting through Lawrence's clinical assessment with razor-sharp authority. If Julian or I fail to check in within the hour, the complete financial forensic report, including Victoria's encrypted communications with the Gideon Corporation, will be delivered directly to federal regulators and every major financial news outlet in the country. This isn't a theater performance, Victoria. It's an indictment. Julian kept his eyes locked on his father. Look at me, father, he commanded softly, the vulnerability leaking into his tone despite his best efforts. Look at your son. I spent 5 years in a living purgatory because of a scandal I didn't commit. I watched from afar as this woman crawled into your life, knowing she was the weapon sent to destroy you. Why are you looking at me with hatred instead of relief? Arthur Vance finally lifted his head. The billionaire CEO looked as if he had aged a decade in the span of 10 minutes. The iron authority that usually radiated from him was replaced by a dark, brooding desperation. He walked down the steps of the altar, stopping just 5 feet from Julian. The resemblance between them was striking. The same sharp jawline, the same piercing gray eyes. But where Julian's eyes burned with a righteous fire, Arthur's were shadowed by a deep, impenetrable midnight. You think you understand the world, Julian, Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. You think everything is a matter of ledger balances and corporate loyalty. You think I am blind to what Victoria is. Julian froze. The space between his shoulder blades tightened. What? Arthur cast a cold, sideways glance at Victoria, who actually took a step back, her eyes widening in genuine surprise. Did you really believe I became a billionaire by being oblivious to the people in my bed? Arthur turned back to Julian, his expression hardening into a mask of pure tragedy. Victoria's little offshore excursions are pennies compared to the larger picture. I knew exactly what she was doing. I allowed it. You allowed her to bleed your own company? Julian's voice cracked, the sheer absurdity of the statement rattling his core. To fund the Gideons? The people who drove Mother's family into bankruptcy. You don't know the truth about your mother's family, Julian. And you don't know why you were sent away. Arthur roared, his composure fracturing for a brief, terrifying second before he reined it back in. He took a deep breath, his chest heaving. Your presence here doesn't save Vance Global. It accelerates its destruction. By bringing this into the light, you haven't stopped a wedding, you've triggered a dead man's switch that will bury us all. Before Julian could process the weight of his father's words, the sudden shrill sound of an alarm began to echo from the security room down the hall. The tactical lights in the ballroom flickered, shifting from warm gold to a stark emergency amber. Lawrence Miller's phone buzzed violently in his hand. He looked at the screen and a dark, triumphal smile spread across his face. It seems our friends at the Gideon Corporation aren't waiting for the wedding certificate anymore, Mr. Vance. The public broadcast of your son's little revelation just triggered an automatic margin call on your primary credit facility. The hostile takeover hasn't been stopped. It just began. Julian felt a cold dread sink into his stomach. A red herring. He had thought the wedding was the finish line, the moment Victoria would seize power. But Victoria wasn't the mastermind, she was just the bait. Her public exposure was the exact catalyst the Gideons needed to panic the market and force a forced liquidation of the Vance family shares. In the sudden chaos of flashing amber lights and distant sirens, Clara grabbed Julian's arm. Her grip was tight, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. Julian, we have to go. No. Lawrence's security team isn't bound by corporate protocol anymore. If they get that flash drive back, we lose everything. Julian looked at his father one last time, seeing a man caught in a trap of his own making. The emotional tension between them was a frayed wire ready to snap. Julian wanted to scream, to demand the answers to the questions that had haunted his exile for 5 years. But the raw urgency of the moment left no room for answers. Julian grabbed Clara's hand, the warmth of her touch giving him the strength to turn his back on his father once again. We go to the server room in the East Wing, Julian whispered fiercely to her as they backed away from the altar. If the Gideons are triggering a liquidation, they're doing it from inside our own network. We don't just need to expose Victoria. We have to lock down the entire Vance Global mainframe before they wipe the evidence of who really pulled the trigger 5 years ago. With a final glance at the collapsing fairy tale around them, Julian and Clara turned and bolted through the side exit into the rainy darkness of the estate's corridors, with the sound of pursuing footsteps echoing close behind. The air inside the sub-basement server room was freezing, a stark contrast to the suffocating warmth of the orchid-filled ballroom above. The rhythmic mechanical hum of thousands of blade servers created a low vibrating drone that echoed off the reinforced concrete walls. Rows of blinking blue and amber LED lights cast long dancing shadows across the floor, making the subterranean sanctuary feel like the true cold heart of the Vance Empire. Julian leaned heavily against a metal server rack, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His tailored coat was damp from the rain that had lashed them during their frantic dash through the estate's outer courtyards. Beside him, Clara was already buried in her tablet, her fingers flying across the touchscreen as she bypassed security protocols with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years navigating the corporate mainframe. "I've initiated a temporary firewall," Clara whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion. She looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the cool blue glow of the monitors. For a moment the corporate armor dropped, and Julian saw the profound vulnerability hidden beneath. But Julian, Lawrence's team is systematically overriding the security grid from the primary residence. We have less than 10 minutes before they completely isolate this terminal. Julian stepped closer to her, the proximity between them bridging the icy distance of the room. He reached out, his hand gently resting over hers on the edge of the console. The warmth of her skin was the only anchor he had left in a world that was rapidly spinning out of control. "Clara, thank you. For not running when the doors closed. For believing me when everyone else thought I was a ghost." Clara looked down at their joined hands, a soft, bittersweet smile touching her lips. "I never stopped looking for you, Julian. When you disappeared 5 years ago, they told us it was a financial scandal, that you had embezzled from your mother's foundation. But I knew the boy who used to share his books with me. I knew you couldn't do that. I stayed at Vance Global because I knew sooner or later, you'd come back to clear her name." The emotional weight of her words broke through Julian's hardened exterior, a tender moment of absolute shared vulnerability amidst the looming danger. He leaned in, his forehead briefly resting against hers, drawing strength from her unwavering loyalty. "We're going to finish this," he murmured fiercely. "I promise." "Julian, look at this," Clara suddenly gasped, her posture freezing as a massive file directory opened on the screen. The encrypted layers of the Aegis Holdings ledger were unfolding, but as the data unzipped, it didn't list Victoria Sterling's credentials at the top of the hierarchy. The primary administrative access key belonged to Arthur Vance. Julian's blood ran completely cold. He stared at the screen, his mind violently rejecting the data his eyes were processing. "No, that's impossible. This is the shell company that has been funding the Gideon Corporation's hostile takeover. This is the entity draining our assets." He frantically began scrolling through the digital signatures, his fingers trembling. It wasn't a corporate raid. It was a controlled demolition. "Your father isn't being manipulated by Victoria," Clara whispered, her voice hollow with shock as she analyzed the forensic trail. "Julian, Arthur created Aegis Holdings. Victoria didn't infiltrate Vance Global. Arthur brought her in to act as the public scapegoat. He's been funneling his own billions into the Gideon Corporation for the last 3 years." Julian felt a sickening sensation of betrayal wash over him, far more devastating than the exile he had suffered. The father he had tried to save, the man whose legacy he had fought to protect, was the one holding the torch to the castle. "Why?" Julian choked out, his voice cracking with raw, unfiltered agony. "Why would he destroy everything he and my mother built? Why would he alliance himself with the very people who ruined her family?" He clicked on a deeply buried, double-encrypted subdirectory labeled Project Clara. A single document opened. It was a medical examiner's report from 12 years ago, the night of the fire that had taken Julian's mother. Appended to the report was a confidential settlement agreement between Arthur Vance and the Gideon Corporation, dated just 48 hours after her death. The truth hit Julian like a physical blow, shattering everything he believed about his past. His mother's death hadn't been an accident. She had uncovered a catastrophic environmental liability in the Gideon Corporation's chemical shipping lines. A liability that, if exposed, would have bankrupted both the Gideons and their primary investor, Vance Global. To protect the empire, Arthur hadn't just covered up the crime. He had entered into a horrific pact with the Gideons, sacrificing his wife's justice for corporate survival. And 5 years ago, when Julian had started asking too many questions about his mother's old foundation accounts, Arthur hadn't exiled his son out of anger. He had done it to keep Julian from discovering that his own father was complicit in his mother's death. "He didn't erase me to punish me," Julian whispered, tears of absolute fury and heartbreak finally spilling over his eyelids. "He erased me to protect himself." "Julian." Clara reached for him, her eyes wide with deep empathy and horror, but before she could wrap her arms around him, the server room's heavy steel door hissed open. The amber emergency lights caught the sharp, polished silhouette of Arthur Vance standing in the doorway. He wasn't accompanied by guards. He stood alone, holding a master override key, his eyes hollowed out by a lifetime of carrying a monstrous secret. "Now you know," Arthur said, his voice flat, dead, and entirely devoid of hope. "Now you know why you should have stayed dead, Julian. Are you as absolutely shattered by this revelation as Julian is? The betrayal goes deeper than anyone could have ever imagined. How can Julian fight a war when his own father is the ultimate villain? Type your thoughts in the comments below, and please, if you are desperate to see justice served for Julian and his mother, subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the darkest hour of this journey. The stakes had just reached their absolute zenith. The wedding was a smokescreen, the socialite was a pawn, and Julian was standing face to face with the man who had traded his family's souls for a corporate throne. The freezing air of the server room seemed to solidify into blocks of ice as Arthur Vance stepped over the threshold. The heavy steel door slid shut behind him with a definitive hydraulic hiss, locking the three of them into a subterranean vault of flashing amber lights and mechanical groans. Julian stood paralyzed, the digital ghost of his mother's true cause of death still glowing cruelly against his face. The universe had tilted entirely on its axis. Every sacrifice he had made during his 5 years of exile, every night he had slept on a concrete floor dreaming of saving his father's legacy, had been a lie. He hadn't been fighting to save a king from a predator. He had been trying to protect the monster who built the cage. "How could you?" Julian's voice didn't rise to a shout. It was a broken, bleeding whisper that carried more agony than a scream. He walked toward his father, his steps uncoordinated, his hands trembling violently. "She loved you. She built the foundation of this company with her own bare hands. And you traded her life to protect a balance sheet with the Gideons." Arthur didn't flinch, but his eyes looked like hollowed-out craters. "You look at the world through the lens of a child, Julian. Your mother was a saint, yes, but saints burn empires down. If she had released that data, the liabilities would have triggered an international cross-default. Vance Global would have collapsed in 48 hours. 10,000 employees would have lost their livelihoods. Our family would have been hunted by creditors to the edge of the earth. So you let them kill her?" Julian roared, the dam finally breaking. He lunged forward, but Clara grabbed his arm, her small hands anchoring him with a desperate, crying strength. "Julian, look at him," Clara pleaded, her own tears tracking down her cheeks, her voice thick with terror and profound grief. "He's trying to provoke you. He wants you to lose control." She turned her fierce, intelligent gaze to Arthur, her body still acting as a shield for the man she loved. "You brought Victoria in because you knew she was a known corporate parasite. You wanted her to take the blame for the liquidation so you could retire to a non-extradition country with the Gideon payouts, leaving Julian's mother's memory buried forever." "A very astute legal mind, Clara," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly detached clinical register. He lifted the master override key, a sleek black device with a glowing crimson interface. "Which is why it is such a tragedy that neither of you will be leaving this facility to present your findings." With a sudden, decisive motion, Arthur slammed the override key into the central auxiliary console. Instantly, the blue server lights died. The mechanical hum vanished, replaced by a high-pitched, piercing siren that tore through the small room. A mechanical voice echoed from the ceiling. "Emergency environmental isolation initiated. Halon gas suppression system activated in T-60 seconds." Julian's heart plummeted into a dark abyss of pure desperation. Halon gas. It was designed to extinguish server fires by rapidly displacing all oxygen in the room. In less than a minute, the room would become an airtight vacuum. There were no windows, no secondary exits, and the reinforced steel door was electronically locked by the master override. Arthur, you're going to kill your own son. Clara screamed, lunging toward the console, but the system interface was already completely dead, locked behind a flashing red administrative wall. Julian is already dead to the world, Arthur whispered, a single heavy tear finally escaping his hollow eyes and rolling down his wrinkled cheek. He died 5 years ago. I tried to keep him away. I paid for his safety in exile. But he chose to come back. He chose to dig up the one truth that cannot exist in the light. Arthur turned, swiping his biometric card against the manual release override on the inside of the frame, stepping back out into the corridor. Father. Julian threw his weight against the thick reinforced glass pane of the door just as it slammed shut and sealed with a sickening airtight click. Through the glass, Julian watched his father turn his back on him for the final time, walking away into the dim, shadowy corridor of the estate, leaving his only child to suffocate in the dark. Inside the server room, a low, ominous hissing sound began to echo from the ceiling vents. The air instantly grew heavy, metallic, and thin. The first tendrils of the invisible gas began to drop, suffocating the ambient oxygen. Clara collapsed against the console, coughing weakly as the lack of air began to take an immediate toll on her system. Julian rushed to her side, sliding down the metal rack to gather her into his arms. He pulled her tight against his chest, trying to shield her face with his coat, though he knew it was entirely futile. The separation from life, from justice, and from the future they had just begun to imagine together felt absolutely insurmountable. They were trapped in the belly of the beast, completely erased. Are you crying for Julian and Clara right now? This is the ultimate betrayal. A father leaving his own son to die in the dark to protect a monstrous corporate secret. The situation is completely hopeless, the air is running out and the light is fading. Is this truly the end of the Vance lineage? Leave your thoughts and messages of support for Julian in the comments below. And please, if you are praying for a miracle, hit that subscribe button right now to see if they can survive the darkest hour. Julian held Clara closer, his throat burning, his vision beginning to blur with dark vignette edges as his lungs screamed for oxygen. He looked down at the silver flash drive still clutched in his hand, wondering if his mother had felt this exact same suffocating despair 12 years ago. The air was almost entirely gone. Each breath Julian took felt like inhaling liquid lead, his lungs screaming as the invisible halon gas pushed the last remnants of oxygen toward the ceiling. In his arms, Clara's eyelids fluttered weakly, her dark hair damp against his collarbone. Her fingers feebly clutched at his coat, her breathing shallow and ragged. Julian, she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound in the terrifying siren-wailing darkness. I'm sorry. I couldn't save her name. Shoo, don't talk. Julian choked out, his own vision tunneling into a narrowing pinprick of light. A profound wave of despair threatened to swallow him whole. Is this how it ends? He thought. The same way it ended for my mother? Suffocated and erased in the dark by the man who was supposed to protect us? But as the darkness threatened to pull him under, a sudden blinding white-hot spark of fury ignited deep within his chest. He refused to let his mother's murder be the final chapter. He refused to let Clara die in this concrete tomb just because she chose to believe in him. True strength wasn't about the billions his father controlled, or the armies of security guards at the altar. True strength was the unyielding truth he held in his hands. His eyes, watering and burning from the chemical atmosphere, locked onto the small silver flash drive still squeezed tightly in his fist. He remembered something, a detail from his years spent rebuilding his life as a systems architect in the underground tech sectors of Europe. Every commercial halon suppression system built in the last 15 years had a physical, mechanical failsafe required by international safety codes. It wasn't controlled by a computer. It wasn't digital. It was purely mechanical. Clara, stay with me, Julian rasped, his voice dropping into a fierce, raw growl of determination. He gently laid her down against the base of the console where the remaining pockets of dense air lingered. Using the last reserves of his physical energy, Julian dragged himself across the floor toward the primary climate control manifold hidden behind the main server rack. His muscles ached, and his brain felt as though it were being starved of blood, but love and an absolute refusal to lose gave him a sudden, superhuman burst of adrenaline. He kicked open the small metal maintenance hatch at the bottom of the manifold. Inside lay a maze of copper pipes and pressurized valves. There it was, a bright yellow manual pressure release lever, stamped with a mechanical override warning. It was sealed with a heavy lead wire. Julian didn't have tools. He didn't have time. He slammed his forearm against the lead seal, utilizing his entire body weight. The metal bit deep into his flesh, drawing a sharp line of blood, but he ignored the pain. He threw his shoulder into it again. The wire shattered. Julian grabbed the yellow lever with both hands and threw his weight downward, pulling it past the rusted locking mechanism. Instantly, a deafening, thunderous roar echoed through the subbasement. The high-pressure vent lines reversed, violently exhausting the toxic halon gas out through the roof while pulling fresh, rainy autumn air directly into the room from the outer intake valves. Julian fell to his knees, sucking in a massive, agonizing breath of cool, oxygen-rich air. He coughed violently, his chest heaving as life rushed back into his veins. He didn't waste a single second. He crawled back to Clara, pulling her up into his arms as she too began to gasp and cough, her eyes snapping open as life returned to her face. "Julian, you did it," she breathed, her hands flying to his face, her eyes filled with a profound, tearful adoration. The relief between them was an electric current, a moment of deep, unadulterated love and survival that solidified their bond forever. They had looked into the abyss of death and found the strength to climb out together. "We have to move," Julian said, his voice raw but completely steady now. The fear was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating courage. The pressure reversal just triggered a physical system fault. The electronic locks on the door are designed to release automatically during a pressure failure so emergency crews can enter. As if on cue, the heavy steel door clicked loudly and slid back 6 inches, revealing the dimly lit corridor outside. Julian stood up, pulling Clara up with him. He plugged the silver flash drive into his pocket, his mind perfectly clear. His father thought he had buried the truth, but Arthur had forgot one critical thing. He had raised Julian to be a Vance. And a Vance never backs down from a fight when everything is on the line. The final confrontation was set. The wedding may have collapsed into a corporate war zone, but Julian was about to bring the real storm directly to his father's feet. "Are you cheering for Julian and Claire right now? They survived the unmitigated trap of the millennium. The tables are turning and the truth is coming for Arthur Vance." Type "justice" in the comments section right now if you want to see Julian take down the Empire. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to witness the epic climax next. Julian grabbed Clara's hand, their eyes locking in a silent pact of absolute loyalty. Together they pushed the heavy steel door open and stepped out into the corridor, marching upward toward the light of the main estate to finish what was started 12 years ago. The grand double doors of the Beaumont ballroom didn't just open. They shattered inward against the wall as Julian and Clara strode back into the epicenter of the Vance Empire. The room was no longer a sanctuary of high society elegance. It was a war room in the final stages of a siege. Arthur Vance stood behind the shattered altar, surrounded by Lawrence Miller and a tight perimeter of 6 heavily armed private tactical security guards. Victoria Sterling was backed into a corner, her white silk bridal train torn and trampled, her face a mask of frantic, sweating panic as she screamed into a satellite phone. The amber emergency lights pulsed rhythmically, casting long, monstrous shadows across the thousands of wilting white orchids. "Secure the perimeter. I don't care about the ye, get the transport chopper on the roof now." Lawrence Miller roared to his men, his wolfish facade completely replaced by the desperation of a trapped criminal. "It's too late, Lawrence." Julian's voice cut through the chaos like a localized thunderclap. Arthur Vance snapped his head around, his eyes widening into absolute, paralyzed disbelief. His master override key dropped from his hand, clattering against the marble floor. To Arthur, Julian wasn't just a son returning from exile anymore. He was a living, breathing avatar of retribution, flanked by Clara, whose eyes burned with the judicial fury of 1,000 wronged families. "Impossible," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking as he staggered backward against the altar table. The isolation system, you couldn't have. You forgot that Mom didn't just teach me how to love literature, Father. She taught me how to look at the blueprints of the things you built, Julian said, his boots clicking with slow, terrifying deliberation as he walked down the center aisle. He didn't look at the weapons pointed at his chest. He looked only at his father. Shoot him. Victoria shrieked from the corner, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Julian. He's going to ruin everything. Shoot him and say he was an aggressive intruder. The guards hesitated, their hands tightening on their holsters. But before a single weapon could be unholstered, Clara lifted her tablet high into the air, her voice ringing out with supreme legal and emotional authority. If a single weapon is drawn, the live broadcast changes from a data stream to a public execution broadcast, Clara announced, her finger hovering over a glowing green icon on her screen. Julian didn't just mirror the server files. 10 minutes ago, when the pressure valves reversed, we routed Vance Global's internal security feed directly to the federal servers, the state police command structure, and the live media pool parked at your front gates. The entire world is watching this room right now. On the massive projection screens behind the altar, the financial ledgers suddenly vanished. They were replaced by a live, scrolling feed of public news broadcasts. Title banners reading Vance Global so implicated in cover-up and fraud, and Heir returns from the dead with evidence of murder settlement, flashed in blinding red letters. The stock price of Vance Global wasn't just tanking, it was experiencing a total, catastrophic institutional reset. Lawrence Miller looked at the screens, realized the game was entirely over, and slowly dropped his hands to his sides, backing away from Arthur like a rat fleeing a burning ship. I'm out. This is a homicide investigation now. I'm not going down for the Gideons. Lawrence. You coward. Victoria screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sudden deafening sound of police sirens echoing up the long winding driveway of the estate outside. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the rainy darkness of the windows, overpowering the amber emergency strobe. Julian stopped just 3 feet from his father, separated only by the fallen marriage altar. The emotional contrast between the two men was total. Arthur was broken, a hollow shell of corporate greed crushed under the weight of his own historical sins. Julian stood tall, authentic, his chest heaving not with hatred, but with a profound, liberating sense of justice. 5 years ago, you asked me why I couldn't just let the past stay buried, Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register that vibrated with 12 years of suppressed grief. You told me the empire was worth more than a single life. Look around you, father. Look at your empire. It's nothing but a pile of burning ash and expensive flowers. You sacrificed Mom for a throne, and now the throne is going to be your prison. Arthur looked at the screens, then down at his hands, which were shaking so violently he could no longer close them into fists. The legendary billionaire patriarch fell to his knees, his shoulders slumping as the final agonizing realization hit him. He had lost his company, his freedom, and his son, all to protect a lie that had survived for only 12 years. Julian. Arthur choked out, looking up with eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic plea for forgiveness. But I did it to keep the Vance name alive. No, Julian said softly, his gray eyes shining with tears of absolute triumph and emotional release. You did it to keep yourself alive. But today the Vance name belongs to someone who actually remembers what it means to be a human being. With a sudden violent crash, the grand ballroom windows at the back of the room were shattered inward as state tactical units breached the perimeter, their flashlights cutting through the dust and rain. Victoria and Lawrence were immediately thrown to the ground and handcuffed, their high society masks completely shattered into screams of protest. But Julian didn't look back at them. As the officers surrounded Arthur to read him his rights, Julian turned around and looked at Clara. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, beautiful clarity. He reached out and Clara ran into his arms, her embrace a tight, fierce sanctuary against the chaos of the flashing lights and shouting officers. He buried his face in her hair, feeling the steady rhythmic beat of her heart against his chest. They had fought through the dark, they had stared down death, and they had won. Are you cheering at the top of your lungs for Julian and Clara right now? Justice has finally been served, the wicked have fallen, and the true heir has reclaimed his soul. Type triumph in the comments section below if you are incredibly moved by this ending. And hit that subscribe button right now to see how Julian and Clara rebuild their lives in our final, emotional conclusion. Julian held Clara tighter as the rain began to clear outside, the first faint light of a new dawn breaking through the fractured glass windows of the ballroom. 6 months later, the heavy, suffocating scent of imported white orchids was gone, replaced by the crisp, life-giving fragrance of autumn pine and fresh earth. The rain that had once lashed the windows of the Beaumont estate like a violent curse had cleared, giving way to a brilliant golden morning sun that washed over the sprawling courtyard of the new Vance Memorial Children's Foundation. Julian stood on the stone terrace, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, looking out over the manicured lawns where children from the local community were laughing and playing. The grand, imposing architecture of the old estate had been fundamentally transformed. The cold marble walls had been warmed with bright wooden paneling, large open windows, and walls filled with vibrant artwork. It was no longer a fortress built on a foundation of corporate secrets. It had become a living sanctuary of hope, healing, and light. Vance Global had survived the storm, but it was no longer the predatory machine Arthur Vance had constructed. Under Julian's leadership as the newly appointed chairman, the corporation had underwent a massive historic restructuring. Every asset tied to the corrupt alliances with the Gideon Corporation had been liquidated and channeled into transparent, community-driven green manufacturing initiatives. The stock price had not just recovered, it had reached an all-time high, driven by public trust and institutional investors who wanted to be part of a company with an actual soul. Arthur Vance's trial had ended 3 weeks prior with a definitive lifetime federal sentence, while Victoria Sterling and Lawrence Miller were facing decades in maximum security facilities for corporate treason and grand embezzlement. Justice had been absolute, swift, and unyielding. But as Julian took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind didn't dwell on the courtrooms or the prison cells. His gaze shifted down to the lawn, where Clara was standing beside a newly unveiled bronze statue of Clara Vance, Julian's mother. The inscription at the base read, "The truth will not remain buried. It will rise to light the path for others." Clara looked up toward the terrace, her dark hair catching the golden autumn sunlight, and a warm, radiant smile broke across her face. Seeing her there, Julian felt a profound, overwhelming wave of fulfillment and peace wash over his chest. The 5 years of freezing anonymity, the agonizing nights of exile, and the crushing weight of betrayal had vanished like morning mist. He was no longer a ghost hiding in the shadows. He was a man who had reclaimed his name, cleared his mother's legacy, and found an unbreakable anchor for his soul. He set his coffee down and walked down the stone steps into the courtyard, his boots stepping softly on the fallen leaves. As he approached, Clara stepped away from the statue and met him halfway, her hand reaching out to instantly slide into his. The warmth of her touch was a beautiful, familiar current that immediately settled any remaining echoes of his past grief. The board of directors just finalized the final approval for the scholarship endowment, Clara murmured softly, her eyes shining with an immense, tearful pride as she looked up at him. "Everything your mother ever dreamed of building is finally real, Julian. We did it." "No," Julian said gently, his voice thick with emotion as he reached up with his free hand to softly brush a stray strand of dark hair away from her cheek. He leaned down, his eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "We didn't just do it. You saved me from disappearing into the dark forever. Without you, Clara, I would have just been a man looking for a fight. With you, I found something worth building a future for." Clara's smile softened into a look of absolute, deep physical and emotional intimacy. She leaned into his chest, her arms wrapping around his neck as he pulled her tight against him. They stood together in the center of the sun-drenched courtyard, a perfect picture of reunion, love, recovery, and a beautiful new beginning. The Vance lineage had survived its darkest trial, and from the ashes of a fractured empire, a true legacy of love had finally blossomed. Thank you so much from the very bottom of my heart, my beautiful family, for staying with us through every single twist and emotional turn of Julian and Clara's spectacular journey. Your incredible love and support mean the absolute world to me. If you felt the power of justice, love, and redemption in this ending, please leave a comment down below with your favorite moments, hit that thumbs up button, and smash that subscribe button right now to join our family for many more unforgettable stories to come. Until next time, stay safe, stay blessed, and I will see you in the next video.